Is the screen visible to all? Okay.
Yes,
We're going
ma'am.
to look at the emergence of Commonwealth literature. We are trying to understand the term Commonwealth. And then we'll be talking about Commonwealth literature. Fine. So now, when you're talking about, as I told you in the beginning, when you're talking about post-colonialism and post-colonial studies or the department of post-colonialism in different universities, the whole understanding of post-colonialism, we need to understand the term called Commonwealth literature. It was this Commonwealth literature that led to the development of post-colonial studies. So first we are going to look at what is this Commonwealth literature, or what was the criteria using which various critics they clubbed together the literatures from all these various countries which were which were earlier under the British rule. So this term Commonwealth and Commonwealth literature, it was in fashion, in vogue, as in fashion, in use since the 1950s. So this was spoken of and used by academics in many universities in the West. So this particular term, it describes the literatures. It's not just one kind, many kinds. Literatures in English coming from the countries with a common history of colonialism. So all these countries are unified and united by their shared common history. And what is that history? That once upon a time, all these countries were under the power, under the rule of the British Empire. We are mainly talking about the British Empire because that was the biggest colonizer. So you have countries like the European settler communities. So when you're talking about European settler communities, you have places like Australia, Canada, all that would come under that. And then there were those countries getting independence. We know till the end of 1950s and 60s also the process was going on, wherein many countries were gaining independence from these colonizers. So those who were gaining independence, and also countries from the African, Caribbean, and South Asian countries. So India included in that. So literature from all these diverse areas, diverse countries of the world come under Commonwealth literature. And what was the attempt or purpose of clubbing these literary works together? It was to identify and to locate all the literary work that was happening in these countries, and then there is a comparison. These critics, what do? They try to compare the common concerns and characteristics that are told in these literary voices, because every literary text, every literature is actually a voice of that particular country, right? So now all these countries are unified by one link. And what is that one link? That all of them were once upon a time colonies. So the idea is to identify and locate the literary activity that is happening in all these various ex colonies. Earlier they were colonies, now they are all independent countries. So now you look at some of the um, writers who are familiar to us. Just a very few examples. India, you have R.K. Narayan. Then there are many more. We're just talking about one or two examples. Then from Barbados, you have West Indies, Barbados. You have George Lamming. New Zealand, Catherine Mansfield. Nigeria, Chinua Achebe. I hope you're familiar with all these names. Right? These are some of the major names with people who wrote, especially during the initial stages of the emergence of post-colonial literature. Now, from where did this term come from? Commonwealth. Who coined it? Where exactly do we find the beginning of this whole idea of this all, this union of all these countries which were once upon a time under the British Empire to be clubbed together as Commonwealth countries? The establishment was like, the beginning was there was this union, this group of Commonwealth nations, all the countries that were once upon a time under Great Britain, they were all put together by Great Britain itself. and that was known as the British Commonwealth of Nations. The British Commonwealth of Nations. This was before these countries becoming independent. Please remember that. So when Great Britain was a colonizer, it had most of the countries under its crown. Most of the countries under its crown. So what they did was they established this charter of nations, charter as in a group of nations called Commonwealth of British Commonwealth of Nations. So it had all these countries and the dominions. Dominions are the countries under the British Empire, and then it also showed the continuing allegiance to Britain. So this group showed that all these countries were under the British crown, and their allegiance as in that link and subservience. You remember they were paying taxes. For instance, all the colonies in America, they were uh, paying Great Britain every year. They had to pay some some amount or whatever. So they were all kind of under this great yoke or the great power of Great Britain. So this term British Commonwealth of Nations was the beginning. And later, what happened by the 20th century, we know that many of these countries they started becoming independent. So this relationship of the master and the ruled, that is between Great Britain and the other countries, that dominion. Who was dominating? Great Britain was dominating, and all these other countries were dominions. That is the regions under the rule of Great Britain. So this started changing in the first half of the 20th century, and then slowly this old meaning of Commonwealth started changing. Earlier, if you remember, the title was British Commonwealth of Nations. So later what happened, once the country started becoming independent and breaking away and fighting against Great Britain, that term was dropped. Uh, so later it became just Commonwealth of Nations. So in initial stages, many countries were breaking free. So at that time also Great Britain, it continued with the system of holding conferences. They were called colonial conferences. So there were these frequent colonial conferences conducted by Britain in the early decades. And then who attended these meetings, these conferences? Governors and heads of the colonies. So the ones who broke away and went, they didn't take part, or they were not much a part of this. But then the governors and heads of the colonies were expected to attend the colonial conferences. And please remember that British was dropped from there. And later in 1907, these conferences were renamed as imperial conferences. Now, after the Second World War, it was called Commonwealth conferences. They dropped this title also, imperial. Imperial, it shows a lot of power and political dominance. So imperial conferences gave way to Commonwealth conferences. And especially after the Second World War, we know the British Empire more or less, you could say, came to an end. So this group, it consisted of heads of state of the newly independent countries, which were no more under Great Britain, but still they came under a common umbrella, wherein in the belief that they all had something in common with each other. Now, now, what is this Commonwealth? Who is the head of the Commonwealth? The British monarch. So right now we have Queen Elizabeth. So whoever is on the throne is the figurehead of the Commonwealth. So the British monarch is the head of the Commonwealth, and this headship, that headship is only symbolic. He or she does not have any real power over all these Commonwealth countries. It's just an idea, just an understanding. So there is no established political authority, no more political authority. And after the war, especially, the term became more equitable. Equitable as in talking about equal countries, countries that are equal. So now nobody is superior, nobody is inferior. Just because they all have this common inheritance or that common background, that's why they all are kind of coming under this bracket, this particular umbrella term called Commonwealth. So it can be seen as an association of sovereign nations, sovereign as in independent, and republic nations without deference to a single authority. Deference as in paying, you could say, subservience or paying respect to a single authority. Earlier, this was there, paying respect, paying taxes, and becoming subservient to one authority, that was Great Britain. But now, later, after the World War and all, this became more or less a relationship between equals, or it was assumed that there is equality. Now, Britain is no more the, you could say, controlling or domineering force. So this was the understanding assumption. So there is no constitution, there is no legal authority, and membership is not compulsory to be a part of the Commonwealth of Nations. So Ireland and Burma, they left the group in 1948. So they are not part of the Commonwealth anymore. So there is no force. It's only if you want to come together that they can come to the group and then conduct whatever activities. For instance, the Commonwealth of Nations, they have conferences every year, international conferences in various fields, literature, education, sciences, it happens. And we also know Commonwealth Games, the sporting event, even that is there. Some countries are part of it, but some have decided to stay away. So that's the history of the term Commonwealth. So nobody's inferior, nobody's superior. It's just an idea. An idea. There is no written constitution, and Britain does not have any authority, any legal authority over anyone. And again, you cannot make use of force. Now, moving on. Now, when you're talking about Commonwealth literature, when you're talking about Commonwealth literature, there is a problem. Why? Because there are certain things that are sticking out. There are certain things that cannot be actually accepted as equal or common. So, how common is Commonwealth literature? That is the question. So, like Canada was a colony, so was India. But then, can you really compare India with Canada when you're talking about the political system, maybe, or maybe you're talking about the economic situation in various countries? There's simply no comparison, right? So there are certain things which we need to keep in mind. So initially they assumed, it's very easy for these professors to sit inside the college campus or university campus and think and write about theory, whereas the reality may be different. So we need to avoid the selective view of equality. Though it was happily believed that all the countries are the same, all these ex colonies, so it's okay, or we can put all of them together and we can have a common discussion because everybody would be the same. But that is not the case, because economic and political relationships between Britain and the Commonwealth nations, it's far from being equal. They're not at all equal. As I give you the example of Canada and India, there's a lot of difference between these two countries. So the suggestion was to talk about a shared valuable literary inheritance between the very different and variable nations. What was the idea? They all believed that Britain had significance presence in all these colonies, right? So the years that was spent by Great Britain in these countries had led to these countries also becoming proficient in English, becoming open to English literature, becoming, you could say, learning from them. And then you have the beginning of writers in English in these countries. So you talk about Rajaram Mohan Roy, or you talk about Rao, you talk about R.K. Narayan. All these are actually products of the British Empire, or it was because the British was here that they also got that Western education, that Western ideology, and they were inspired, influenced, or whatever you could say, by English literature. And then it was also assumed that the text written by all these writers, the Commonwealth writers, it addressed mainly a Western English speaking readership. because they believed all these writers are actually mimicking, they are following their British counterparts. So as a result, they are actually like the Britishers or the British writers. And again, when you're talking about the term Commonwealth, that term itself will not free you from the associations with Great Britain. So whenever we're talking about Great Britain, obviously it was kind of a relationship between the master and the ruled. So again, where is equality when you're talking about the British and the ruled countries, right? So this term was not free from the more older and imperious as in that using power, the political clout connotations of the term Commonwealth. So we are going to look at many of these problems in the use of the word Commonwealth literature. One is assuming that all the writers have inherited whatever was given by Great Britain. Another assumption was all these texts written by people from writers from these Commonwealth nations were mainly keeping in mind the Western speaking readership. Then again, that superiority of Great Britain was somehow or the other ingrained into the psyche of the people. And then again, there's this assumption. Assumptions are ideas, not the reality. That idea was that there's a relationship between literature and the nation, which is correct to a great extent. And they also said that local literature, it started blooming in these colonies along with the development of a nationalist sentiment. So there was these critics. We are talking about the early critics, okay? Early critics who are trying to understand Commonwealth literature. So they said that local literature did not exist there. It was only after the British people went there that they started writing, and even the local literature, the growth and development of local literature could be seen coinciding with that nationalist movement. It was only because of nationalist movement that many countries had these freedom of fights and struggle for freedom and then becoming free. But there are fallacies. Whatever these critics thought actually is not the truth. It was only a very limited way of understanding by these early critics. And these people, they stressed on identifying a common goal shared among different nations that went beyond the mere local affairs. So these critics, what they did was actually they were trying to read the literature from these Commonwealth countries, looking for universality and timelessness. See, as students of literature, by the time you come to third year, you know what are the hallmarks or what are the touchstones of literature. There are different people who are given different touchstones, right? That hallmark of literature. Many talk about universality. That is, great literature is that which stands the test of time, and it talks to the common human emotions anywhere in the world, and that's why we keep on putting Shakespeare right up there on a pedestal. Why? Because he speaks to people across centuries. So even after 400 years of Shakespeare, we still value him, venerate him. We have revisions of Shakespeare, we have re-revisions, yeah, the canon formation. So they're talking about mainly the English canon, and they're using the English canon to measure as well as evaluate people from the Commonwealth countries. So they are not giving importance to the local flavor, uh, the ideas of resistance, the idea that they beg to differ, that they are different from the Western writers, or they are not really trying to follow the Western canon. So these things were not really touched upon or understood by the earlier critics. So they stressed on identifying a common goal that was there among the different nations, and they wanted to look beyond the local affairs. They did not give any importance to the local affairs that was happening. So they assumed, and the they that we're talking about is the early critics who were trying to slot literatures from these countries under the common umbrella term Commonwealth literature. So they assumed to deal with different communities with a common set of concerns, and they want, they talked about reaching across national borders and dealing with universal concern, the English canon, the English literary canon. Now, again, when you're problematizing the whole thing, these early critics, they gave the need to recognize the important cultural differences between writers from different regions. Okay, they said it is important to understand the difference that is there in different culture. But see the second part, that's more important. They try to reveal how Commonwealth literature was unified through the category of Commonwealth literature. So what does this mean? What these writers, they are saying, all right, there is difference between, say a writer from Nigeria to what a person from Barbados is trying to say. There is difference, that is okay, but then more than that, there is something common between all this. So they're trying to club together everything under a universal umbrella, again calling it Commonwealth. Commonwealth as in the wealth of all these countries. But the question that we need to ask is it really common? So how common is Commonwealth? That's a question. So they use the same criteria and canon that was used to evaluate the old, age-old English classics. And they talked about how Indian writers would be more pressurized than, say, somebody from Canada while writing in English. So the predominant understanding was Commonwealth literature refers to people from these Commonwealth countries, that is ex-colonies, mainly writing in English. And if you're writing in English, obviously you're addressing yourself to a Western English speaking audience, thereby you're following the Western canon. That was the understanding. So they talk about the pressure on Indian writers and how they have to work more hard compared to people from other settler colonies like Australia, New Zealand, or Canada. So, according to them, good writers are to be judged by the universal, lasting quality of writings and not by the local flavor, local or the national flavor, sentiments that was there. So, what was important? The lasting quality. So, that timelessness. So, Commonwealth of Literature, according to them, was nothing but a subtext of canonical English literature, therefore catering to the ideals, catering to the ideals of timelessness and universality. And then now when you look back and try and understand what these people were trying to say, we can see that these people, the early critics, they could be put under the label liberal humanist. Maybe you can call them liberal humanists. Liberal humanists are those critics or people who practice literature by looking for the common themes that are there across ages, across time, and across countries. They are not worried about the local flavor, whatever. All right. So these critics, when they were reading the text written by people from these various colonies, they actually failed to recognize certain things. They did not notice. What did they not notice? That the text that they were reading were actually resisting their reading practices. And what was their reading practices? Their reading practices were based on the Western canon. But then these texts were actually very, very different. They were not actually written according to the Western canon. So there was this resistance, and it was challenging the assumptions of universality and timelessness. So these assumptions were challenged. For instance, you talk about 100 Years of Solitude, or you talk about Garcia Marquez, right? The kind of works he writes, even Chinua Achebe, they're all very, very topical, and talks about a particular experience in the whole history of the particular country. But then these Commonwealth critics, what were they doing? They were looking for these assumptions. What assumption of what? Universality and timelessness, and they were not considering the historical, the geographical, and the cultural specifics. So they wanted these texts to confirm, that is to follow a critical status quo. Critical status quo as it no change, same rule applies for everything. Same size fits everyone. So they wanted to read every literary text that emerged from these countries based on this critical status quo. So they were overlooking the resistance, the experimental elements, the novelty, the local focus. All these things were overlooked. They found all these things very exciting. Okay, it's very nice to read, uh, all these experimental kind of stuff. But then what would they do? They would try to limit and restrict these readings by making use of the English literary canon, that is looking for universal themes and safely all these contradictory readings as well as the resistential readings, they were kind of put away. And then they would try and label all these works as one lot, all of them almost the same, and how they were following the English literary canon. Now, before we write them off, before we kind of dismiss the literary critics of the earlier part, that is all these earlier literary critics who were talking about Commonwealth literature, we also need to thank them because it is because of some of their activities that we have this field called post-colonial studies today. So we need to be grateful for that. So in what way did they contribute? Just because they were able to create this new identity, Commonwealth literature, they were the ones responsible, or they were the ones who were instrumental in establishing this as an important category of artistic endeavor. Earlier, people never thought about it. So at least a new identity was given to the writings of these writers who came from these various Commonwealth countries. They also helped in establishing this as a proper area of academic study. So many universities and colleges, even for instance, that the very reason that we are studying a paper on post-colonial literature is thanks to these early critics, the Commonwealth literary critics, who, though their ideas and things did not really hold, but at least this was a contribution made by them. So they proved that this is a viable area of academic study. So they created spaces on university English courses for Commonwealth literature. So when you're doing that, when you're creating space for a particular course, you are actually doing a political act. So this became a very important political investment. And it's later that we know, with the coming of many theorists and all, that this field became a very, very powerful field, using which we are now looking back and we are trying to make sense of what has happened and what is happening. You understand? So all this has been made possible thanks to these people. So this has been made into a major field meriting serious attention, just as the classics. So you talk about classics and all along with your other classics papers and literary criticism. Now we are studying a paper on post-colonial literature thanks to the emergence of Commonwealth literature and these critics. So this laid the foundation for various post-colonial criticism and deliberation. I hope this has gone down with you, understood what the writer is trying to tell us. So right now what we are doing is we are just taking a trip, a journey into post-colonial studies. So we have not yet reached post-colonial studies. We are in the process of entering the field. So in order to enter that, we need to understand colonization and then decolonization, and then this term Commonwealth, from that Commonwealth literature, and from that slowly moving on to colonial discourses. That is during the time of colonization itself, you have certain people who had started writing about what is colonization and what is colonization doing to people in various countries. And from that, slowly we'll be moving on to post-colonial experience and what it means to be a post-colonial writer, and what these different writers who have been prescribed in our syllabus, what they're trying to tell us. So take a deep breath and just let the things sink. and then shoot questions if any.